As law enforcement officers, you operate under applicable law. Criminal charge codes are the same for juveniles as they are for adults. However, it's important to be familiar with the juvenile code for the state of Missouri. It can be found in chapters 210 and 211 of the revised Missouri statutes.
Some of you may be asking yourself, why are the juvenile and adult systems so different? Well, the juvenile court system is restorative, designed to rehabilitate young offenders and help them transition into a viable asset in the community.
There are 3 different referrals to the juvenile office. 1, juvenile delinquency. 2, status. 3, abuse and neglect.
Many times youth may commit what's called a delinquency act, which by statute is considered a criminal act. And then they also have what are called status offenses. So those are things that are illegal for children to do just based off of their status as a juvenile or not being an adult. So skipping school, running away from home, incorrigibility or refusal to follow directives at home. Those are things that we many times see as an issue that needs to be treated, but doesn't necessarily mean they need to be maybe arrested for or taken into detention for.
Knowing the differences between these offenses are critical because of the numerous factors in handling each offense. Over the next few minutes, we will break down some of these factors. The age of a child is a critical element in determining whether a matter is subject to the jurisdiction of the juvenile court. Generally, in cases of delinquency or status offenses, the juvenile court has jurisdiction of a child until his or her 17th birthday. Keep in mind, the applicable age in these cases is the age at which the alleged offense was committed.
In abuse and neglect cases, the juvenile court has jurisdiction of the juvenile until the juvenile reaches his or her 21st birthday.
The location where juvenile matters are held vary from case to case. Ask yourself, does the juvenile reside here? Was the juvenile found here? Was the offense committed here? Your answers to these questions determine whether or not your county's juvenile office has jurisdiction. Regardless, your jurisdiction's juvenile office must be contacted. It's important to relay your findings to these questions to the responding juvenile officer.
Now that you've taken the juvenile into custody, you'll need to make sure you get his pedigree information as well as the arrest charges. You'll then need to contact the juvenile office and speak to a juvenile officer who will then use this information to complete the JDTA, which is the Juvenile Detention Assessment Form. The juvenile officer will then decide at that point to release the child to a guardian and a parent and/or a suitable adult, or transport the juvenile to a supervised detention center.
This may look different in each jurisdiction. It's important to contact your local juvenile office regarding policy and procedures of presenting a juvenile. If the juvenile is released on scene, you still must complete a report on the incident.
The report will go to the juvenile office where it will be screened and processed accordingly.
When transporting a juvenile, use all precautions you would for handling an adult. Remember, federal and state laws prohibit juvenile offenders from having sight or sound contact with adult offenders.
If the juvenile is alleged to have committed a felony act, or an order from the court for a non-felony act is received requiring fingerprinting or photographing, continue to ensure that the juvenile is separated from adult offenders.
You may not interrogate the juvenile prior to having the juvenile officer, the juvenile's parent or guardian, and/or the juvenile's attorney present for questioning.
Should you request an interview with the juvenile, you must wait until all parties are present and the juvenile has been read his or her Miranda rights from the juvenile officer or the juvenile officer's designee.
When holding a juvenile pending transfer of jurisdiction to the juvenile officer, these guidelines must be followed. A delinquent offender may be placed in a locked holding cell and handcuffed to a stationary object for no more than 6 hours. A status offender cannot be held in a locked holding cell or handcuffed to any stationary object for any amount of time. Status offenders must have a path of free exit from the building. Continuous visual supervision of the juvenile must be maintained. At no time is sight or verbal contact with adult offenders permitted.
Once the juvenile officer arrives, jurisdiction is then transferred to him or her. Depending on the information on the JDTA, the juvenile officer could offer an alternative to detention or authorize the juvenile be transferred to a juvenile detention facility. If this occurs, the juvenile officer will ask the police officer for a probable cause statement, which will be filed with the juvenile court. I don't know about you, but as a police officer, I get pretty frustrated taking the same juveniles into custody on numerous occasions, yet they never score a detention. What is this JDTA form, and how effective is it in reducing recidivism? In the next segment, we'll introduce the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative, and we'll break down just how effective this model is.